All right, good morning. This is the history lesson for the week. The American Republic. All right. So this week is this chapter 11, kind of goes over, if we look at it, constitutional democracy, and I'll cover that in a second. We go over that. They go over American ideas, and we go over preserving the Constitution. So I'm just going to go through the chapters and just briefly describe the content and what we're going to be talking about. Okay, first we talk about checks and balances and sharing powers. Last week we talked about the three branches of government. Now the three branches of government, if you remember, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. Now they are, in theory, are all supposed to check each other, but in the last since about 9/11, we've been seeing more and more power being consolidated in the executive branch. So, one thing about our government and one thing we always have to realize is that it is changeable. We have a constitution, but our constitution's changeable, laws change, and court rulings change over time. So, when you sit back and do not participate in government, you're responsible for the direction it goes just as much as if you do participate. We have a democracy and a constitutional democracy, which means we're part of our government. We vote in legislators and judges and other officials who make decisions for us, and we're responsible for picking those people, and we have power in picking them. So you need to be part of this, and you need to be aware. So we're going to look at the checks and balances of government real quick. So the legislative branch has checks over the judicial and executive. So the legislative branch, they pass a law, and if the president, let's say, vetoes it, the legislator can re-vote on it, and they can overturn the president's veto. And a veto means a rejection, saying no. So they can. It takes a higher percent of the legislation to pass that, but they can do that. And the legislative also can make amendments to the Constitution that the judicial branch have to follow. So they write laws that, and they can change the Constitution, then the judicial branch has to follow that. They also approve Supreme Court nominees. Okay, so that's their checks on the other groups of government. So the executive, they can overturn a veto. The judicial, they approve of Supreme Court nominees, and they can change the Constitution. Okay, it needs presidential approval as well. So the president, or the executive branch, he can veto bills that are passed by Congress, and he appoints nominees to the Supreme Court. Okay, so those are his checks and balances, and these are simplified. But if you look on page 459, this gives an outline of this. And the judicial branch can rule that the president's actions are unconstitutional, and can rule that the laws that the legislative branch pass are unconstitutional, and this happens quite a bit. So that's kind of a good thing. The judicial branch has a lot of power. So it's important who becomes their Supreme Court nominees and who ends up getting in the Supreme Court. Because they have a lot. So that's checks and balances. In theory, each branch of government, the judicial, legislative, and executive, have a check on the power of the other two. Okay, so that's the idea of checks and balances. Okay, now it goes in from that, we talk about state powers. Now, the idea of state powers, we have what we call as a federal government, so a centralized government. Okay, the powers of the national government, and it's on page, 461. You'll see powers of state government and powers of national government. Now, I'm not going to put these in notes because they're in your book. You can read. So the powers of the national government control trade between states and foreign countries. So what that says, a state like California, we can't negotiate with China directly. We can't make a deal with China. The federal government can, as far as like what taxes on goods, tariffs, and tariffs are tax on goods coming and going to other countries. Create and maintain an army or navy. Okay, the federal government has the army and navy. States can't do that. Now, we do have a National Guard that's based in the state, but it's still under control of the federal government. Okay, states can't print money or coins, only the federal government. States can't allow new states to join. Okay, so Hawaii was the last state to join, and the federal government has to decide that. Some say Puerto Rico should become a state. It is a territory of the United States. It is part of the United States, and some say it should become the 51st state, but it would have to be part of the federal government. And I doubt Trump, since he wasn't really there with the natural disasters that have happened there recently, so I doubt he'll want it as a state. Declare war. California can't go declare war on Canada or North Korea. Has to be by the federal government. Make laws for immigration or citizenship. So even though, we have sanctuary cities in California, we cannot dictate the laws of people coming in from other countries into California. That's a federal law. Conduct a census. Okay, so the census is going on right now. I got a piece of mail. I actually got to get online and do my census. The census is done by the national government, and it's to allocate funds, how to tax, and keep track of the population. Censuses go back at least to Rome. I know Rome did a census, and it's a way to allocate taxes, how to tax population, how to allocate funding for different communities, how many judges are going to be needed in a certain area, things like that. Okay, now state powers. States set up public schools. That makes sense. Have local governments. So, we have a mayor of Oakland. We have a city council. We have counties. So, if you think of like how states are organized, you got cities and towns, and then you have counties, and then you have the state. So states are broken up into counties, and and then those are ruled by different groups of people. The states set up the elections. Every state's elections are a little different. I was just telling you in the last video that the Supreme Court ruled on an election in Wisconsin, where they were going to still have the election even though we're in the middle of the coronavirus. And they said that it was legal for Wisconsin to do it. Probably because it's a conservative judicial branch right now, but there was some heavy dissent or counter arguments by certain of our Supreme Court judges. Control trade within the state. So states do regulate their own laws of business. Like every state has a different taxing and things like that. Make laws. So this is an interesting one. And this is something that's happened in your lifetime. Make laws for marriage and divorce. That's a state-by-state thing. So I think, did it pass? Yeah, I think now we have equal rights and gay marriage in every state, I believe. I think that passed. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up. But there was a time where it went state by state, okay? And every state voted on that. And set qualifications for voting. Now, these last two, the federal government has stepped in. Especially in the 60s when, like Alabama, we watched the Children's March, remember that? There was a lot of federal government stepping in when the southern states weren't allowing blacks and African Americans to vote. So that's, the federal government does step in sometimes on those things. Now, there are shared powers. There's powers that are both the state and federal. So collecting taxes, setting up court systems, establishing banks, borrowing money, making laws to provide for public health and welfare. Okay, so that's on a chart on page 261. Okay, all right, so I'm going to move on. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what's going on here. So the second lesson is American ideas. And this is interesting because this changes. When I was younger, we had to stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance in school, um, and there was, the sense of, a more unified nation than we have now. We have kind of a divided nation. We have very conservative people and very liberal people, and we seem more divided than I remember in my life. I could be wrong, but we seem more divided. I think last time it was this divided was maybe during the Vietnam War, when a part of the population was against the war and part of the population was for the war. But we seem to be in a pretty divided place right now. So I'm going to let you read about this. There's not much I want to comment about American ideas. Just that be careful in life as you go through it. And, they go over the word patriotism in here. And I just would always just emphasize, and I hope something you get out of being in my class and Miss Harris's class, is that you don't just take people's word for things, that you do a little research and you come up with your own ideas about how you feel. And that you look at your country with a little skepticism and realize that, although America is a great country, it has its flaws and it has things we need to work on. And just, there are people who will just, be about their country above everything else and even above their own morals. And that has caused problems in the world. You think about Nazi Germany and people just being fanatical about the German cause and where that led, and so we just have to be careful about the idea of patriotism and being blind to it, nationalism, those type of things. So go ahead and read that one and answer the questions. And let's see. Okay, preserving the Constitution. So a couple things I want to go over is naturalization. So some of us understand that we have sanctuary cities here because under President Trump, he's come really down hard on immigration in this country. But immigration has been a big part of this country for a long time. And when you come to this country, you want to become a citizen, you have to go through something called naturalization, which means you apply, you go through all these steps, and you take a test, and then you become an American citizen. It takes years to do, but it's a very important part of this country. We've had waves of immigrants come into this country since our very beginning. I mean, we talk about Native Americans a lot, but you have to realize that they're a small percent of the population in America, and everybody else is an immigrant. They all immigrated here. So in a sense, we're a country of immigrants, for the better or worse, but we are, and we have to accept that. I have to be careful about what I say as your teacher, but you can look at what the Republicans and Trump does and wonder why they're anti-immigrant, and what that's based on. I'll let you come up with your own assumptions on that, because apparently he's not anti-immigrant but against certain countries. So just, look into it and be wise about what you see. Okay, the last thing is we're going to talk about civil rights. So we talked about the Bill of Rights, and this was added to the Constitution to guarantee rights. Now, there's things like some of our rights in this country is, when you watch cop shows and they say, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say, you have a right to an attorney. Well, we have a right to a trial by jury. So, we're, in this country, assumed innocent till proven guilty, which doesn't always happen. A lot of times it doesn't, especially if you're certain minorities don't really get treated that way. But this does happen. So, we also have a right to vote in our legislators, and we have a right to freedom of speech and several things. So I want you to read through this. There's a timeline here, and I want you to notice when women got the vote. It wasn't until 1920. So that's going on 100 years, just 100 years. Women have the vote. So think about that and this country. And when people praise this country as being, without flaws, well, women only had the right to vote for 100 years. We had slaves. We've took land from Native Americans. Many things this country has done. And there's many great things this country's done. But there's many things that we should actually be critical about and look at. Okay, so I want you to look through this. It's a pretty good timeline. It's on page 476 and 477, and it goes through some of the expanding of civil rights in America. Because remember, when we first had 13 colonies, the people who only really had the rights were kind of well-off white men, right? And we've expanded quite a bit, but we still have a ways to go. So just read through this, think about it, and I think, at least in my class next week, I'm going to do some small group pullouts. Maybe next Wednesday, we'll do when we pull out in full class and do small groups, and I'll ask you some questions to discuss this. Okay, this is important stuff, especially now. A lot has been going on the last few years with civil rights and politics and powers of branches of government. It's complicated, but it's important to know about. I mean, in my opinion, the fact that people don't understand their civil liberties and understand our Constitution, that abuses of power happen. When you know your rights and the laws, and you know how your government should work, you're gonna be more demanding that it works the way it should, and be less likely to be taken advantage of. All right, hope you guys are doing good. Keep up with your work, ask questions in small group and full class. All right, bye guys.